Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our 10th and final Articulate talk for 2024. This is our ancient history talk, Vesuvius AD 79, the day after. We're really excited to have you be here. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. This is an outline of what we'll cover tonight, and I'll quickly run through some housekeeping and then we'll hear from our wonderful presenters about all things Vesuvius. There will be a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and please use the Q&A function at any stage throughout the presentation to submit your questions to our presenters. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at fast.partnerships@sydney.edu.au. Tonight's webinar is delivered in partnership with the Chak Museum, and it couldn't have been possible without Dr. Craig Barker and our very special guest speaker, Dr. Ferdinando de Simone, and their willingness to showcase the latest research and expertise in exploring the secrets of Mount Vesuvius. We are very excited to cover this topic as part of our Articulate Talk series, particularly as it was requested from you, our high schools. And we very much appreciate all the contribution and ideas in designing this talk. We hope everyone here tonight finds it helpful for our upcoming for all your upcoming assessments. And I'll hand over to you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's a great privilege to be able to introduce our speaker this afternoon. On behalf of the Chak Museum, which is the University of Sydney's museum of more than 450,000 items, including archaeological material from around the globe, which includes Pompeii and Herculaneum. The University of Sydney actually has a very strong tradition of working with Pompeii. It's a key component for a number of undergraduate courses in both archaeology and ancient history. One of the founders of the university, Sir Charles Nicholson, who founded the Nicholson collection, which is part of the Chak Museum, visited Pompeii in 1856. The museum itself is home to Lego Pompeii, which was made by Ryan McNaught, the brickman from Lego Masters on television, and a number of Australian scholars or scholars who spent time in Australia have contributed to the overall archaeological investigations of Pompeii and the broader Bay of Naples. This includes Jean-Paul Decadres, who in the 1980s led the University of Sydney's participation in the Houses in Pompeii project, and scholars such as Stephen Ellis, Pim Allison, and Estelle Laser, who will be known to many of you. So it's a great privilege for us at the Chak Museum that actually has material culture from Pompeii here in Australia to be able to partner with our colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science as part of this Articulate series. This is now our second Pompeii talk, so I think this is the beginning of a tradition, and we will have more talks going forward. Our presenter today, Ferdinando de Simone, is a classical archaeologist who has a doctoral degree from the University of Oxford. You'll see his background up on the stage, but one of the amazing things about Ferdinando is his wide range of interests as a scholar. And if you jump on his academia webpage, you'll see a whole range of publications across a whole range of different materials. Since 2004, he has led a very, very significant archaeological project, the Apolline Project, which is a multidisciplinary research investigation, which is exploring the north slope of Mount Vesuvius and the broader hinterland of the Campania region. And this is a really, really exciting development because, of course, we tend to think so much of Pompeii and Herculaneum within that urban context of the ancient cities. So this chance to actually think about the region more holistically has really revolutionized a lot of thinking. And I know that Fernando will talk about some of this research in the presentation tonight. As you'll see, he is an expert in public engagement and public archaeology, and in 2011 received the European Archaeological Heritage Prize But I think for those of you studying Pompeii and Herculaneum, one of the key things that I would like to suggest as an archaeologist is for you guys to be aware of current projects, both fieldwork projects and research projects that are not necessarily in the school textbooks that you're going to be accessing. So a good chance for you to do a little bit of investigation as to who's doing what. Because Fernando is a really good example of some of the cutting edge archaeological work that is taking place both within Pompeii and Herculaneum themselves, but also, as we've mentioned, that broader hinterland area. And that's going to give you some remarkable opportunities in terms of your assessments and exams related to Pompeii, thinking far more holistically. So it's my turn to hand over to Fernando. Thank you very much for joining us all the way from Switzerland this morning.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for the extremely kind words. And thank you all the organizers and Charlotte today for helping us with the setting up of the entire process. So basically what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about the day after of Pompeii, but in order to do so, I'm going to talk first about why we love catastrophes and why this is relevant for our research. And then again, try to highlight what are the current issues in our understanding of Pompeii and Herculaneum. What are the preconceived ideas that make it very much harder for us to take a different look? Because the general message I would like to give today is that if you change your point of view, maybe what you're looking at started changing as well. And so that's what I tried to do with my research in the last 25 years in that area. And this is probably the encouragement I can give you. Try to think sometimes outside of the box, do not go with the flow, try to take a different point of view and see whether what you're looking at changes or not. And that's what I'm trying to show you today. So after I've highlighted what are our preconceived ideas and how much we can change our point of view also through the help of some ethnographic data and use some of the, what can we build after this sort of ruins that we are creating with our previous ideas, and what can we build on it, what are the useful concepts we can use in order to rearrange the archaeological evidence that we have in front of us in order to create something new. And then of course I will highlight what is the methodology that I'm going to apply, and then discuss the ancient lay of the land. So first we're going to describe what the environment was about in antiquity before the eruption of 79, and talking from the lay of the land, the Vesuvius shape, the lay of the land, the cultivations, and what's the economic model we can draw from it. And then we're going to talk about the eruption. Actually, what are the volcanic hazards? And also in that, those regards are going to go beyond the idea of the lava flows and fireballs that we sometimes see in Hollywood movies, and give a more articulated analysis of the damage and the effects on the crops and the land. And then we're going to talk about what happens afterwards. What's the responses that the emperor gives, the comparisons with the previous emperors, and what happens to the countryside, and what are the new sites that start building up in that area. And then we go back to the economic model and see what really was the change between the period before and after the eruption of 80, 79. So let's start with the why we love catastrophes. I mean, as archaeologists, we love catastrophes for one simple reason, because it provides us what I define as a high-resolution data. What I mean by high-resolution data, generally in archaeology, we deal with what remains after the destruction. So, for example, if you think about a Roman villa on the hills of Tuscany, generally what we see today is what remains after the medieval period, the spoliation of the building, and so forth that occurs afterwards. And so what remains is generally just 40, 15 centimeters high. If you're lucky, you can find a mosaic pavement. And that, of course, restricts all the information that we can get from the past. Through catastrophes, we have better preserved results, which means not only full standing buildings, as you've seen in Pompeii and Herculaneum if you visit them or through the photos, but also the plowing furrows, as you can see on the top left image, or the carbonized trees on the top right, or even some imprints of the leaves of the trees that were planted around the site. These are pictures, especially those at the bottom from the sites I'm going to show you later, from the later eruption of Vesuvius. So that's why, as archaeologists, we love catastrophes, especially eruptions. But also as humans, we love catastrophes. And that's something embedded in our DNA. We love that kind of narrative. The tragedy is one of those narratives. And so this looks like a silly argument, but it's a very important one. It's important how we create narratives. And that narrative of everything ending with mayhem, with everybody dying, is a tragic narrative. It's a very, very powerful. And that's why Pompeii and Herculaneum are so successful still today as case studies also for the general public. So we love the idea that everything ends with the eruption. And yeah, but quoting Goethe, no catastrophe has ever yelled so much pleasure to the rest of humanity as that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. Of course, very tragic event, but it harvested a lot of interesting data. But of course, the reality is more complex than that. It's important that we start destroying some of these preconceived ideas. First of all, eruptions are not just one moment. Of course, the eruption occurs, again, not in one moment, but occurs in several days or weeks, but that's just the beginning. So instead of thinking about these as sort of snapshots events, that is actually what we see in the field as archaeology. We see some evidence that is frozen in time, literally. But again, something happens also afterwards. So sometimes it's better to think about natural catastrophes like eruptions, more like vibrating strings, in the sense that there's, of course, a tragic event occurring in very few days, but then there are some after effects that occurs after months, and then some others like a small climate change or diaspora of the survivors that occurs in years, and so forth. So it's good to go beyond the idea of a single moment, because it can open up new fields of research, like what happened to the survivors. And the same goes for some things that we really take for granted. One of these could be the shape of Mount Vesuvius. We have seen this shape that you see in the picture in the Hollywood movies. We have seen these also in academic environments, like during exhibitions and so forth. This one was on the exhibition in Pompeii, in Melbourne, in 2009. Well, this was not the shape of Vesuvius before the eruption that destroyed Pompeii. And this is not a trivial matter because, again, it changes entirely the way in which people lived around the volcano, how much land was available, and so forth. So it's good to keep in mind that we need to build something new and change our perspective on these preconceived ideas. And lastly, of course, eruptions are very tragic moments. People die, people suffer. Also, the land is severely damaged. But is that all to it? Can we also find some bright sides to these natural catastrophes? Through the comparison with other ethnographic data, things that happen also as we speak in other parts of the world, generally eruptions bring also an economic stimulus, because the reconstruction also enhances the local economy. Of course, it destroys first everything, but then it gives a stimulus to rebuild. And also sometimes it brings some technological advancements. It's easier to see in modern day, but I could also bring some examples from the past. But for example, in this picture from Indonesia, they started building houses made out of bamboo, which is more flexible for during the eruptions and earthquakes, and so can withstand these difficulties more easily. But also it changes a lot the local economy. So you start seeing some investment diversification, and in some cases also change the structure of the society. Generally, these catastrophic events are a real shock for the society that can answer in a way or another. So you start looking at things in this way, you understand that we could have a very diverse way of looking at ancient catastrophes. Sometimes we talk just about the doom and gloom. We use terms like disaster, damage, and destruction, which are very negative. And it's important also to talk about the vulnerability of you've seen. Can also we have also witnessed that these natural catastrophes can be even a catalyst for change, an economic stimulus. So it's good that when you talk and other people talk about some of these events, that we are clear about what we mean, what are our perceptions on these catastrophes, because this affects very much the research that we are doing. If you have the preconceived idea that eruptions are just doom and gloom, you're just going to stop on that. But if you think that it will also, there's also a recovery after the catastrophe, you start looking for that. And that's very interesting. In archaeology, we sometimes think that we just study what we find, but it's not true. It's a lot about what kind of questions we ask. And then because of the questions we ask, we can look for something in the field. And so according to the questions, we can refine the techniques or make some analysis. For example, I can focus more on the kind of vegetation that was present after the eruption in 79 and compare it to what was there before. And through that, I can see whether there was the same kind of agriculture or a different one. So you see, it's important to assess and also be frank with yourself and the others of where you stand. How do you perceive the natural catastrophe? Also, we always perceive catastrophes as something objective that occurs in nature, and of course that's the case. But I will say that's more like the natural hazard. Catastrophe really exists when there's a connection with the society. So natural. It's a complex concept, but say just in one sentence, natural hazards require human to become catastrophes. You can have very severe earthquakes or eruptions, but they affect nobody because there are no people there, or there are, for example, many very severe earthquakes occur current days in Japan, but they have most of the buildings that can withstand earthquakes. Other times you have very small events, but in a very densely populated area, and then they create huge damage to societies. So what I'm going to do, basically, it's very simple scheme. I'm going to describe first what the ancient landscape was, and then describe the catastrophe per se, the events, the volcanic event, and how it destroyed the landscape. Then we can discuss about how much time would have taken for the land to recover. And then we are going to evaluate some of the possibilities. On one hand, we could be very optimistic and say, okay, that's which actually reflects the optimal behavior. Was the minimum time for the land to recover? That's probably the approach they could have taken. We can also think about what happened to the landscape also as a sort of opportunity for new settlers to come in and develop more in that area. And also then through the archaeological evidence, we can compare what these theoretical models present with what the evidence really shows, and see whether there's an asymmetry, whether there's a difference between the optimal behavior and the real behavior of humans. And that's basically what I like to do. It's important to understand what humans can really choose, why they've not chosen the optimal behavior, because of cultural concerns, connection with other people, difficulties in the economy, and so forth. So that's really where the real archaeology takes in. And then we can evaluate also the responses to the land. On the one, the state response that we can witness, especially through the literary sources, and then the response of the people, which we can evaluate through the inscriptions and the archaeology. And then by comparing these two things, we can then really talk about the real recovery after the eruption. So let's start setting up the land. First, let's start with Vesuvius. Vesuvius changed its shape very many times over time. Yes, it was at some point a huge cone, but it was before 16,300 BC. And but as it happens for all the stratovolcanoes, its cone rose and fell very many times. If you want to understand how Vesuvius looked like before the eruption 79, you should look at the picture here on the bottom left. It's how after the eruption of 1900 BC, and that one is the shape that Vesuvius had, before the eruption 79. This shape is the reconstruction that some volcanologists did, but it's interesting to note that this shape is consistent with the description that the ancient sources give, and is consistent also with other evidence. It's a little problematic, difficult to talk now about that, but the shape that we see generally of Bacchus and Vesuvius, that is gonna pop up at some point later, shows that kind of shape. It looks like it's a big cone, but no, it's that shape that is shown. After that, part of it's a sort of, you should imagine it's a sort of, actually it's described the ancient sources as sort of an amphitheater. So you should look at it as a sort of stadium with several peaks, and it was probably open on the side of Herculaneum. But then part of this rim broke and collapsed after the eruption of 79. And from that empty area, the new volcano started rising and falling several times during all the other eruptions that occurred on Mount Vesuvius. So you can see now the new shape of Vesuvius, the one before 79 you can see now in this picture. Here, so one problem is the shape of Vesuvius, the rest is the coastline and what happens in the plain. Here you can see in dark blue the modern day coastline, and in brown there's the reconstruction of the coastline in antiquity. As you can see everywhere here on the Bay of Naples, it was very articulated. We are not sure about some of these layouts, but for sure it was very different from today. If we take a closer look at what happens on the coastline of Pompeii, you can see that several authors, scholars have different models. It's not easy to reconstruct the shape of Vesuvius. Over time, we refine our tools to understand how the shape looked like. Basically, they do some drill cores in the plain, and through that they understand what each eruption did. But it's more complex than that, and that's why we do not agree. There's a problem on the coast, and you can also ignore part of it. But the problem is that from the coast, if we move inland, also the shape of what happens inland is not clear. This was one of the most popular reconstructions on inland, so especially in the river Sarnus. And the general idea is that probably there were some marshes, there was some swamps here. We also know from the ancient sources that the river was a little swampy there, a little slow flowing, and so it created some marshes. But we do not know exactly the outlook of these marshes. The most recent and most complete model is this one created by the German Institute and Professor Seiler. Let's take a better look at that. Yeah, you can see there's the wide area here is the marsh. There you can see the river Sarnus and the marshes. This is the best model we can get today with the technology that we have today. But yet it's complicated because it shows also, in my opinion, it's too large. And one simple reason for that is you also see all the archaeological sites. Some of these are within the marshes, which is not possible. So there are some issues with this reconstruction. Why is this interesting? Because it affects how much land was available for cultivation. So if we imagine that we're all marshes, we should imagine that also the vineyards would have been, which is not possible. So we should be a little cautious about this. So what happens in this land? Again, also another problem is that apart from the vineyards, we also have the divisions of the land that the Romans did. This is what we call centuriations. And we have very many in this area, very well attested. And also especially these red lines means that there's fixed points in the centuriation. And it's weird that some of these would occur in the middle of the marshes. So we need to be cautious about that. But apart from, and again, there's also the last point, which is more important. There's not just Pompeii around Vesuvius, but actually there were other cities. We generally focus on Pompeii here to the south, and then Herculaneum to the west. But then also northwest, there's Neapolis, which was a much bigger city. And the same can be said for Nola here to the north. So Vesuvius was shared by 4 cities, and this is another important element we need to take into account. Now, if we want to understand what happens in the land, we should do some archaeology in the area and see how many sites we can find. One problem is that, again, the archaeology, in order to understand what was going on in the area, we should do some field survey, we should do some excavations. There are 2 issues. One is that the shape of the volcano changed. And so basically part of the area was literally blown out. And the other is that modern urbanization. Since it is a very densely populated area, we cannot really find any archaeological finds today where you see all the brown area. So it's very difficult to assess what was going on. But again, let's not be pessimistic. We can still do a lot in this area. We have found many sites. I've shown you a map with all the sites before. Let's try to see what the landscape looked like before the eruption. The agricultural economy of Pompeii mostly revolved before AD 79 around the production of wine. This is also the significance of this picture of Bacchus. I've published this information, and this is not really the subject of today's topic. So sadly, I have to give you just a summary of the results of this research, but you can read it more. If one tries to understand how many people lived in Pompeii and its countryside, and start looking at how much wine was consumed in antiquity, and there are some studies and estimates for that, and then start looking at the evidence, so how many farmhouses we have, and how much wine was produced in each villa, and the distance from each villa, then you can calculate how much wine was produced around the area. If we do that, and we imagine that 2/3 of what was on the hills was covered by vineyards, and 50% of the plain was covered by vineyards, you can see that there was a lot of surplus. There was a lot of wine produced, much more than the people needed. What is interesting is that this very much specialized production also had a ripple effect on other cultivations. Just for the vine crops, most of the land above the vineyards, between 100 and 400 meters above sea level, was planted with trees chestnuts useful for the production of vine crops. And so most of the land, even when not covered by vineyards, was related to production of something related to the vineyards. And also, if you need also some fuel, the land available on Vesuvius for that was not enough. Even more so if we think about grain, which was the most important staple. So what I'm trying to say is that on one hand, before 79, we see that there's a very much specialized production of wine, because it produced a lot of revenue, and it could be shipped everywhere. We found traces of Pompeian amphora, Vesuvian amphora, so related to the 4 cities, from Britain to Spain and Gaul to Northern Africa, and through Egypt, down to India, so well beyond the limits of the Roman Empire. On the other hand, we see that there was not enough land for some basic needs like grain, but there was no problem with that, because there was a lot of grain coming also from Egypt, for example, through the harbor of Puteoli and Naples in order to feed Rome. So what I'm trying to say is that before 79, we have a very specialized production. And one product like wine could cope with its huge revenues, could cope with the lack of other products. And this creates, on the one hand, sort of interconnected economies between the plains and the mountains. And on the other hand, also gives a very modern sort of economy. And there's a lot of interdependency between small parts of a region, but also one region and some lands overseas. And this somehow subverts the idea of autarky that sometimes we had, that both cities and farms were self-sufficient and could produce everything that people would need. Let's move now to the eruptions. Of course, when we talk about eruptions, again, from the movies, and remember that movies are shot in Hollywood, and Hollywood relies on the American culture, which relies a lot on in this instance, on the volcanoes of the Hawaii. So they always love the lava. If you think about volcanoes, you think about lava. And but lava flows are just one of the effects of the eruption. If you are curious on the latest eruption of Vesuvius that occurred in 1944, we have newsreel footage that you can look on YouTube. And because we were doing World War II and there were already the Allied forces in Naples, you can see that there are small Neapolitan kids coming closer to a lava flow and then getting away from it. Elder ladies watching the lava flow, moving very, very slowly and eating their houses, embedding their houses in the lava flow. So when we think about lava, we should be more cautious about how dangerous it was in antiquity. But of course, it's just one of the effects of the eruptions. I could describe each of these for hours, and it would be way too much. There are way too many eruptions. But in order to assess what damage was created in the area, we should stop very briefly, at least on 3 or 4 of them. Again, lava flows, we know from many paintings also of later eruptions of Vesuvius, 1774. Even here, you have people standing there close to see the volcanic effect. Has huge impact on the land, but because it basically creates some rock that takes 1 century to recover, but generally is very slow, and you can place it very easily on the map. Then it's more dangerous is the Thefra Falls. This is a picture of the eruption of 1872 of the eruption of Vesuvius. And the Thefra Falls, of course, we can plot on a map. We can see how thick it was. And generally you see the huge umbrella, but you need to see this huge umbrella that goes down to Salerno and even further south is just 10 centimeters thick. You can reach up to 2 meters in Pompeii and in the narrowing area in the Sorrentine Peninsula, but also take a look at what happens on the north slope of the volcano. It's not as much. Yes, again, closer look, you can see how thick it is near Pompeii, but also not all areas are affected in the same way. So especially on the plain to the north, it means the plains of Neapolis and Nola, they received almost no Thefra Falls. So you can see that the picture now is changing a little bit. It's not so, I mean, it's catastrophic for the people living in Pompeii, but not as much for all the other people around the volcano. And again, if you see with comparisons with other eruptions, if you have up to 2 meters or more, all vegetation is killed. But if you go to not as thick Thefra Fall, then the damage to the vegetation is partial or minimal, depends on where you are. And that's a very important concept to keep in mind. Then, of course, there's the collapse of the eruptive column and the pyroclastic flows. These are the very dangerous, very hot gases coming. This is what literally blew the brains of the people in Herculaneum back then, because Herculaneum is very close to the center of the volcano. Very dangerous, but also affects a very narrow area around the volcano. And then there are some side effects, like the pyroclastic deposit, but also the lahars, which are flash floods with volcanic soil. And they can occur during the eruption or after the eruption. Sometimes can occur a very long time after the eruption. There was a flash flood, a lahar, in the Apennines near the volcano, occurred 20 years ago. So no eruption there, but when there's too much rain, you can also have these flash floods with all the volcanic deposits that lie on the volcano and on the Apennine mountains nearby. And also, very quickly to close this subject of the damage, there are some other things that sometimes we don't think about. One is progradation. It means the pushing of the land forward. All this volcanic field and so forth pushes the land forward. You can see here the city of Herculaneum in red. You can see the lines near the city of Herculaneum is the ancient coastline. And you see the other line, which is what people witnessed in the 1800s, but also then the later the coastline, you see it moves forward. This changes a lot the layout. And lastly, sometimes people don't think about it, but also bradicism. The highering and lowering of the land occurs also during the eruptions, because basically you empty the volcanic chamber, and so there's also this shifting of the land. We witnessed some of these effects after the eruption of AD 79. There are two tracks of the aqueduct, and the new one, which is on the top right, has to be rebuilt because the other one was too low after the eruption, so the water could not reach Naples, and so a new branch was constructed afterwards. And so, long story short, if we see all this damage, we can put this together. We can see that this is not just the ash and lapilli, it's more than that. If we put all this evidence on top of each other, we can have a map of the cumulative damage of the land. And you can see that, of course, it was very difficult for the people living very close to the volcano, but also for the eruption of AD 79, for the people living in the area of Pompeii, because the wind was blowing in that direction. But the moment you move a little bit outside of that area, you can see that the damage to the vegetation was medium or low, according to where you are, where you were. And also you can see that the cities of Neapolis and Nola, which are on the northwest and north of Mount Vesuvius, did not suffer directly from the eruption. And also part of their land did not suffer that much from the eruption. So now that we have this picture of the damage, how much time did it take to recover? If you are under 2 meters of ash, you can create your new vineyard on top of it. This volcanic field is not very acidic, the one produced by Vesuvius, so it's generally very fertile, actually. The problem is that it takes from 4 to 7 years to have a good harvest. But in case you are in the plain, like in this picture from right after the latest eruption of Vesuvius that occurred in 1944, farmers just take the ash, put it on the side of the plowed furrows or near the vineyards, and you're good to go, because actually it's very fertile. And actually, again, you can put on the sides, but again, that's the optimal behavior. That's the best thing you can do, but not necessarily you do that. This is a trace of plowing furrow in which they did not do that. You can see there's still the ash and the lapilli on top of the plowing furrows. So basically, in this instance, the owner of the land did not do that. Why is that the case? Because probably the owners died, or they decided to change business. We don't know. So we need to collect all this data and then create a new picture of recovery. What happens then? On the one hand, we can focus on what the emperors did. And if we look at what happens in the past, it's clear that the Senate, there was a way of behaving of the Senate and the emperor. There was some not codified, but sort of practices that went on through the different emperors. And so there were different ways in which the emperor could help out. Romans were not so much for irrational behavior. Yeah, we have 5 minutes. I need to rush up, but there are several ways in which the emperor could help out. The easiest way, and that's also what we know from the ancient sources, is that what Titus did was to choose randomly some equites, some knights, who could then look at what happened, see whether they can find the boundaries of the previous plots of land and recover and give it back to the owners and help out the cities, but not the cities that were buried. Pompeii and Herculaneum, there was no way to help those cities, but the cities that suffered, the other cities like Nola and Pompeii that suffered from the earthquakes and all the other side effects of the eruption. And then the resources of the seed were distributed to the population. The picture that we have from the ancient sources is that actually there was the risk from the emperor that some people could benefit from this situation. And sorry to put it bluntly with a joke, this was made after 9/11, so it's a very sad joke. But again, after catastrophes, there's a lot of people who can profit from the new layout and buy literally a lot of land for cheap. You can imagine that probably you or your family died in the eruption, or if you survived, probably don't have the financial stability to wait 4 to 7 years to create a new vineyard and start producing wine again. So again, probably there were some people who wanted to invest in the land. And that's interesting because that's probably what happened. In Pompeii and Herculaneum didn't happen much, of course. We have traces of people coming back. The House of Menander, we have traces of people trying to get in. There are many things missing in Pompeii, like for the forum. So probably the emperor also wanted to take some of the goods, the treasures of the temples, etc. But also some places like the suburban baths were never really fully covered. So people returned there. I studied that. But Herculaneum was even more difficult. But actually, if we put everything on the map, we see that there's much more new settlement on the northern slope of the volcano. The northern slope belonged to the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. So let's look quickly at what evidence we have. And actually then the land of Pompeii was then divided between the two cities of Nola and Nuceria, which survived better. Let's look at what happens on the sites. That's one of the sites in the town of San. All these come from the north slope of Vesuvius. In San Sebastiano, there's a new farmhouse sitting right on top of a previous one. So they chose the same place. The same thing can be on Polena, the site that I've excavated. This is the earliest site. I do understand it's 45. I ask just for 5 more minutes, please, and we can finish. The site of Polena was built right on top of the eruption of AD 79. So it's the earliest site built after the eruption of 79, probably already towards the end of the 1st century AD. And it's a very large villa with very large private bathhouse. This is very important. And again, this is set right on top of the eruption of AD 79, but underneath we found some tiles and some bits of frescoes that made us think that there was also another villa right there in that area. So we see we are building a scheme here. That's the map of the site. Another one in Ponticelli, in the neighborhood of Naples. There's an entire villa destroyed by the eruption 79. A new one is built nearby, right after the eruption and living up until the end of the Roman Empire. There's another one still in Polena. And here we start seeing that there's a theme, which is the theme of Bacchus, the god who helps out with the vine growth. And that's the largest site, the one in Somma Vesuviana, which is very interesting because this has been set after the eruption 79 and it is huge. We started excavating in 2002. So far we have uncovered just the entrance to the villa and it's all embellished and it's as richly decorated. What is interesting, the most important bit, is that everything revolves around the figure of Bacchus, because again, and there's also a very sizable wine cellar, the largest we ever found in Italy. And so what I'm trying to say is that, of course, in Pompeii and Herculaneum, the situation was very tragic. It was impossible to rebuild the new cities. But on the other side of the volcano, since the two cities for that area, Neapolis and Nola, suffered just from the side effects of the eruption, was also easier to resettle the countryside. And the way in which they wanted to resettle is that probably they wanted to start again with the economy of wine. Of course, the area never really returned as rich as it was before, but at least we can see that people were not scared to come back, were not scared to invest in the area. So we see different responses on the south side of the volcano, larger villas, mostly on top of the nearby previous ones on the north slope. And yeah, and so I leave you with this question. What was the role of the cities in the settling of the countryside? And that's pretty interesting. I think that the difference between the north slope and the southern slopes of the volcano was actually about the fact that the two cities on the north slope were still functioning, the brains were still working, and so it was much easier to resettle the countryside.
Thanks so much, Ferdinando. That was fantastic. It's so wonderful to have all your insights and expertise with us this evening. We have lots of questions in our Q&A. First question for you is, do you think that the eruption happened in summer or August? There seems to be a lot of contesting evidence.
Well, rather in summer or October. The problem per se, originally I thought that the problem was not that relevant. And I was wrong. I started looking into it. In my opinion, there's plenty of evidence that tells us that it occurred in October. We have pine cones. The wine harvest was already done. They've already processed the olives. In some cases, we have the pulps of the pumes, what remains of the olives, and the pips were put in one area in one villa. So it already occurred. All that speaks very clearly that occurred not in the summer. Why is this relevant to us? Because it changes a lot the damage. One thing, especially, okay, if you are under Pompeii, there's 2 meters of ash, there's not much you can do for your field. But if you are in another area, which is affected just for 15 centimeters or 30 centimeters, it makes a lot of difference if you have already done the harvest or not.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Another question, does this mean Vesuvius erupted a few times before 79 AD? And has it changed its shape after each eruption before 79 AD?
Yes, of course, I couldn't speak too long about it, but we have so many eruptions of Vesuvius. And actually, we cannot calculate them all because on one hand, there's volcanic remains, and not all eruptions leave much remain in the soil. Because after an eruption, if it's a very small eruption, you also have rains and other stuff that wash away part of the remain of the volcanic debris. On the other hand, we have many tales also. We have many, it's the most documented eruption. So from AD 79, all the others, many of the others have been discovered. And that's what makes this land very, very rich. Give you two quick examples. One is the eruption that occurred during the Bronze Age. And so we have the huts, the imprints of the huts in the field. And so we can reconstruct exactly as we do for Pompeii life during the Bronze Age period. But also we have the other eruption that I mentioned just briefly at the beginning, but also it's the one that allowed me to show you the sites towards the end, which occurred in AD 472, which is very interesting because it's towards the end of the Roman Empire. That's what I focus in. I focus in the economy of what late empire, what happens at the end of the Roman Empire through the evidence, the rich evidence that the eruption gives us. And again, there have been very, very many. It changed a lot. Another important one was in 1632. We even have etchings, drawings of that area, which looks like a footage because it shows in each frame how Vesuvius changed its shape during the eruption. And the latest was, again, in 1944. You've seen the photos.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Can you speak a little bit about what archaeological projects are currently happening in Pompeii?
Well, that will take an entire thing. If you allow me, there's been a talk already in your articulate series. You can Google it. You can find it because it will take forever. I'm sorry not to talk too much about that.
No, that's okay. We don't have a lot of time.
Compare. There are a few, mostly are made by the superintendents, the park archaeological, and they started working especially on the areas which were not excavated. As you know, 1/3 of Pompeii has not been excavated yet, and so yeah, there's a lot going on. But about new rooms, etc., is just from the park of Pompeii. Generally, when you talk about several archaeological projects there, they dig on the under the ancient pavement, so they go for the previous phases rather than new rooms. At least I can give you this bit of information.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Another question's come through. What were the social, economic, and political impacts of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79?
Again, the two cities disappeared. Many people died, but in my opinion, there are some preconceived ideas that people thought. Some people still today think, oh well, probably in antiquity they thought that these were the gods and raging against them and so forth. No, they were very practical. They didn't know this was a volcano. I don't agree with that. The problem is that, for example, we in antiquity, both Greeks and Romans, did not have a term for volcano or eruption. So when you also look in the ancient sources or the inscriptions, they generally talk about a mountain, they generally talk about a fire when we're talking about, burning fields because of the lava, for example, or earthquakes, but they do not use the term because they did not have it. So that makes it difficult. But the way in which Vesuvius is described in the ancient sources, it's compared to Mount Etna, which in antiquity as today currently erupted. So I think they knew that it was original volcano. There was a huge earthquake in AD 62, which shocked really all the population and inspired Seneca to write the Naturales Questiones, because they were interested about understanding why the earthquakes were occurring. And so, in my opinion, they knew that that was a volcano. So the people before, and before the eruption, that's the other thing. It's not the eruption comes abruptly. There are very many earthquakes. So after AD 62, which was a wake-up call for all the people, there have been very many other earthquakes, also a few days before the eruption, probably. And so I think the people who had the wealth and had probably other villas can go to the countryside or can go to another place of the Bay of Naples or elsewhere in other regions did. And that's why we had some slaves, or the new generations of former slaves, freedmen, who took over a little bit in Pompeii and so forth. But also, and I recommend you, there's a study of Professor Chak, who through the inscriptions can tell us about the survivors. He found out the relatives of the people who died in Pompeii, scattered. Some of them went in other regions of Italy, but some of them just looked for friends, so moved to Naples, etc. Probably was a new neighborhood in Naples in which all the survivors from Herculaneum were dispatched. And so again, the evidence is not that rich, but through the inscriptions, through also what the ancient sources tell us about what Titus did. First, think about the survivors, then try to harvest the treasures of the main temples, then use the money to create the new roads, recover the roads that were destroyed, and help rebuild the temples in the cities of Neapolis and Nola, Sorrento, and so forth, so that also the private people in those cities can be stimulated to spend some money to help out the surviving cities. And again, about the fields, I've shown you the things. If you were in the wrong side of the volcano, it could be more than 2 meters of ash. Hardly you could do anything, but you can have a new patch of land, cultivated land right on top. But if you're on the other side, if you have just 10, 15 centimeters, you can straight away start recovering and having a new harvest afterwards.
Thank you. Thanks, Ferdinando. We might do 2 more questions because we're running out of time. Can you speak any more about Bacchus? I'm pronouncing that correctly, my apologies, and why the figure was so prevalent in the rebuilt villas?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that, actually spent too much time on that, but the economy, in a nutshell, the agricultural economy of Pompeii and of many of especially Pompeii, but also the other cities' agricultural economy of the 4 cities around Vesuvius before 79 was focused around the wine production. So if you think about Bacchus or Dionysus, if you may, in ancient perspective, you should not think about, the belly god drinking wine, having fun, like you can see in the Disney picture movies, but rather like a god who can protect your harvest. Is a very serious business. And also through all of that, I mean, wine production was so much embedded in the common day life of all the people living around Vesuvius that's really took a lot of their mental space, I would say. Wine production was the main business, and so also the cult of the god was very, very prominent. And that's interesting that the cult of the god remained also after the eruption. And we have traces of inscriptions for the cult of the god also in Naples up until the end of the Roman Empire, when pagans were persecuted. So it was a very, very important one.
Thank you, Ferdinando. We might do one more question. Our last one for this evening. Do you think the ideologies of those living in the area changed significantly after the eruption of 79 AD?
A very broad question. Let's say that through that, of course, it's very difficult to get into the people's heads. But when we do not have archaeological evidence, we have comparisons that we can draw with modern days and so forth. I have also lived in a very tragic earthquake. I was just 2 years old. And I can tell from my experience, but also from the experience of all the other people in the area, what we know also from modern day, humans process the problem. And so immediately they were scared, and there was a trauma like you would have during the war or so. It's a life-changing event. Then you somehow cope with it, go on, process it. And eventually, if more earthquakes or things of that kind occur, also your evaluation of the risk lowers. So we have a lot of evidence from Italy, from Mount Etna, but also from across the world as humans. I mean, regardless of your culture or, in this case, time frame, we behave in the same way. So I think it occurred the same way.
Thank you so much, Ferdinando. Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering all of those questions. And we also have our fantastic Articulate High School newsletter. So you can sign up to our newsletter and hear all about our high school programs that are coming up next year as well. Huge thank you to Ferdinando and Dr. Craig Barker for joining us this evening. Thank you for your insightful presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us online and sent questions through to Ferdinando. It's been a fantastic presentation and really insightful, and we're so lucky to have you here all the way from Switzerland this evening. And I know you've got up very early for us, so we're very, very appreciative. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.